Thank you very much. We are China Team A. We're here to talk about American engagement with China, which we believe to be the best U.S. policy in the region. I'm Samantha Murray. As Professor McAllister mentioned, I'm the team leader. We have a variety of experts in the field to talk to you today. We have Ref Damane, who will be talking about power transitions, Lourdes Orlando, who's our military expert, Will Hayes, who's our regional powers expert, and Garrett Wilson, who will be talking about the effects between the U.S. and the American and Chinese economies. So, to begin, we call our position the peaceful pivot, and I'm going to explain to you exactly what that means. I'd like to start by summarizing our position. It's based on two main points. The first is that China is not a threat, and the second is that engagement is in America's best interest. So to address why China is not a threat, a lot of people who assume that China is a threat are using power transition theory to say that China, as a comparatively weaker power to the U.S., whose power is growing, China's power is growing to be clear, will be dissatisfied with the system and will attempt to better their position in the global system. But we believe that power transition theory should not be relied upon in the 21st century. The effects of new technologies and communication greatly changes how great powers interact with one another and how people interact across different states. And to rely on a theory that was built to apply to 19th and 20th century politics is simply an unreliable way of determining how U.S. policy should be written. Also, we believe that China's military is so inferior to the U.S. that to assume that it is a threat is a gross overstatement of China's capabilities, and the economic and political repercussions that would come from China using their military against U.S. interests far outweigh whatever gains China would acquire by using military force in the region. Also, we believe that engagement is in America's best interest, and we believe that the way to achieve engagement is to integrate China into multilateral institutions, to foster trade talks and diplomatic relations with its neighbors, members of ASEAN, and we're going to talk exactly about how we think that's possible. So to outline a little further why engagement is a better strategy than containment, I'd like to begin by talking about the power limitations that China has that not a lot of people give enough credit to. We hear these statistics about China's GDP and about their giant population, both of which are growing, and that seems threatening, but it really should not be as threatening as we make it out to be. For example, GDP is an important measure of a country's power, but as economists are always pointing out, it does not account for a variety of variables that also influence Chinese capabilities. One of the biggest variables is the Chinese population. China is home to 1.3 billion people, and when we see what Chinese policymakers are doing in the region, we multiply whatever they're doing by 1.3 billion, and that sounds really scary to us. But really, in fact, if you're a Chinese policymaker, you take the policies that you're proposing and you divide by 1.3 billion, and you make sure if the citizenry of your country is if you're responsible for them, if you are meeting their needs. And when you look at it from that perspective, it's a lot less radical of policies that China is pursuing. We believe that this combined with the domestic concerns and externalities are a big severely influence China's capabilities and detract from its ability to pour its resources into things like foreign policy or its military, both of which are big concerns to the U.S. So we think that those concerns are exaggerated and should not be played up quite as much as they are currently. We also believe that China is a practical power, and it's not in its best interest to be aggressive towards the U.S. It is aware of that. Instead, both countries should reach towards diplomacy and economic integration. Again, I'd like to reiterate that power transition theory is a fundamentally misguided way of calculating China as a threat, and that to treat China as an enemy is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we are to treat China as an enemy, it will see this as inflammatory and will start acting as an enemy, and that's not something in either country's interest. So to better explain the peaceful pivot and what we mean by this, it's a spin-off on the Obama administration's current pivot towards Asia. There's no denying that East Asia is a vital interest to the U.S., and we like a lot of what the Obama administration is doing in the region. We like, for example, that the president is going to attend the East Asia Summit for the first time in November. We like that China and the U.S. are working together on non-proliferation treaties. We think it's great that there is going to be a permanent diplomat to the Association of Southeast Asian States and a treaty of amity and cooperation with ASEAN as well. Those are all wonderful. The things that we don't like that the Obama administration is currently doing is this focus on militarization, which we think is actually a setback to our goals in the region because it promotes distrust between two nations when really war or any sort of military escalation is in neither side's interest. So instead, what we're proposing is that we focus on joint interests in East Asia and we use economic incentives to keep China as an active cooperative member in multilateral institutions and international politics, that we include China in more trade agreements with international partners, especially their neighbors. These can be trade agreements that are already in the works or trade agreements in the future. And we believe that we should increase military transparency and confidence-building exercises between the two nations. And we believe that if policy members follow these guidelines, we can usher in an era of increased peace and prosperity for all involved. Thank you.
My name is Ref, and I'll be talking about power transition theory as it applies to the current China-U.S. relationship today. As Sam's already alluded, we're going to argue that power transitions need not to lead into conflict, and in fact they should be used as avenues to provide to strengthen the relationship between China and the U.S. and to be used as an opportunity to be embraced to further growth of such relationship. Power transition theory is usually invoked by those people who see China's rights as threatening, but it is a hostile antagonistic theory which no longer has relevant application in the 21st century. Policymakers should not be buying into prescriptions of power transition theory because it is crippling and it is detrimental to policy decisions, particularly when the past 2 decades of China-U.S. relationship have been so fruitful and encouraging. Since the 1950s, when power transition was first conceived, the world has fundamentally changed. There's technological innovations, there's increased globalizations, which means there's increased communications between our political states, and which was much more different in the 19th century and the 20th century when power transitions led into conflict. But our main argument is that it would be a mistake today to view China as a 21st century equivalent of Imperial Germany or Tojo Japan. And as such, policymakers should not be following a theory that is so fundamentally flawed, which could even lead to confrontation in the future. And I'll be further talking about the main tenets of power transition theory, which I believe are essentially flawed. Okay. The first one is that power transition theory stipulates that the danger of war increases when a dissatisfied challenger catches up or even surpasses an established satisfied power. And the motivation of the war rests solely on the dissatisfied power as the one that will initiate conflict. But the framework of dissatisfied versus satisfied power is a little bit misguided because it is very hard to quantify what is a satisfied power or what is a dissatisfied power. And to put matters into perspective today, it will be very hard to say China is a dissatisfied power when it has reaping so many benefits from the current international system. More important for application for policymaking, power transition theory does very little to explain how a dominant state can turn a rising power into a satisfied one. There's very little research that is done to explore the role of confidence building measures as a means of creating a satisfied power in terms of power transition theory. Again, power transition theory rests motivation to wage war as solely a province of a rising power. It ignores the fact that a dominant power in itself has a huge stake in maintaining the status quo as it exists today. Because of the focus on the system, it also essentially ignores state perception of itself. And it is very hard in this day to argue that China views the US as a diminished power so much that it will be willing to overhaul the current system. Second problem of power transition theory is its conception of national power as a function of population, economic productivity, and political capacity to extract resources. It is an outdated and archaic view because measuring power is not an exact science. We'd have to decide on what metrics to use for measuring power, and we'd have to decide on whether we're talking about power in resources or we're talking about power in outcomes. And to say, if we care about power and outcomes, it is very highly elusive, and it is far contingent and relative on too many factors to be used as a variable for power transition theory. Again, The third thing that power transition theory ignores or essentially minimizes is the deterrent effects of war. Nuclear deterrence has rendered impractical a war against another nuclear power. China and the USA both possess nuclear weapons. Again, the vast Pacific Ocean between China and the USA makes war even more unlikely. Therefore, PTT essentially, the incentives encouraging such a war are overruled by nuclear deterrence and geographical obstruction. PTT essentially misspecifies the causal mechanisms that may lead to war, and this hole in PTT is a significant gap that leaves little hope to policymakers to better navigate rising power, dominant power relations. It is a flawed social science theory that holds no relevance to the situation as it exists today between China and the USA. We understand that the history of power transitions have been filled with bloodshed, but there's no reason why China and the USA should not be willing to blaze a new path out of this deadly contest. We want to avoid the tragedy of past power transitions in the 21st century, so that we view the rise of China as an opportunity, and therefore we should essentially ignore the prescriptions of power transition theory as it applies today between China and the USA.
All right, let's talk about military strategy, because that will shape how we interact with China. To understand our strategy, let's get some things clear. The U.S. invests $925 billion into the military. As of 2012, China has invested only $100 billion into its military. The U.S. has about 11 aircraft carriers and 3 more on the docks in making. This shows innovation and superiority of U.S. military power. There is no contestation that the U.S. is the superior power in the region. And because of that, we can say that we are more secure in our stance in the region. China must divide its spending between naval power and its demands on its borders within its area. So we can move on to China now. What does this say about understanding Chinese capabilities? China's capabilities are inferior to those of the United States. So what does this tell us about intentions? The truth is not much. Chinese interests lie in regional security and border stability. The neutralizing capabilities that they are researching are limited and caused by the disparity of U.S. power in the region. The concern on them is exaggerated, although Team B will tell you that China is willing to incur retaliation by attacking Taiwan and or a shoal in the South China Sea. This is highly unlikely because it's worked so hard to interact in the international arena that it is currently in. So what does this say about aggression? We believe aggression will not occur for 3 reasons. One, it is detrimental to Chinese interests. The effects of encirclement and potential bandwagoning will upset the economic and security of China. 2, the demands and realities of the Chinese military tax their ability to invest completely in naval advancement. They have extensive land borders and issues within their own country to take care of. And the sheer U.S. superiority and power protection capabilities in the region allow the U.S. to respond quickly and strongly to any attack or provocation by China. So to conclude, China will not risk losing its hard-earned progress or military capabilities in a glory campaign. So in light of this understanding, the current pivot to Asia, we believe, is inflammatory and encourages increased security dilemma and an unnecessary security dilemma. It contains instead of engages, and an example of this are the bases and troops that are being built up in the region. China responded negatively to the buildup in Australia, although we tried to convince them the U.S. tried to convince them it was only for defense, but obviously this is difficult for a variety of reasons. China is a growing power, and they wish to secure their own influence and security without any U.S. Guarantees. They don't need that. So in addition to the bases and troops, the air and sea tactic that the United States is pursuing will only encourage arms races in the region and escalation. So what we're trying to encourage is more understanding between the 2 nations. And although I'm saying that China does not yet have the capabilities to completely counteract the United States, our position will be inflammatory and inhibits any progress toward amity in our relationship. So, aggression is unlikely and disadvantageous for China, so our goals are to decrease the security dilemma that is in place and encourage a positive-sum strategy so that misunderstanding and escalation does not occur in the region. So, our policy recommendations begin by recognizing that treating China like an enemy will only create an enemy. It is better to recognize the advantages of U.S. superiority and work from a position of strength to encourage Chinese engagement in a world that is advantageous for all of us. So what does this look like? Our policy recommendations are the meeting of high-level officials, confidence-building initiatives, joint naval operations, like saving people at sea, everyone can agree on that, the sharing of white papers to encourage transparency and familiarize the interests and goals between the two militaries, so again, misunderstanding does not occur. We also proposed cooperation on apolitical issues like cybersecurity and piracy and encouraging the safety of trade routes because, again, this is something that encourages mutually beneficial behavior between the two nations and is only beneficial for regional development as well. We have a great example of this currently. In May of 2012, the U.S. and China engaged in the strategic and economic dialogue. Although it is lagging currently because of some internal issues, these forums are key to peace and progress in the region. They encourage discussion and transparency, obviously, and sharing of the goals for either country, which are key to moving towards peace and prosperity in the region. This is a better outcome than containing China and will allow for a peaceful strategy that does not inhibit the progress in this and other areas in the region, so that so we can focus on regional stability and economic progress to hopefully overcome potential military disagreements. So to conclude, we believe that China has everything to gain from cooperation and that the U.S. has nothing to lose.
The rise of China has been met by regional states with the proliferation of multilateral institutions and heightened economic integration. We believe that this represents one of the most positive trends towards regional stability in the area, and that the U.S., in engaging China in these institutions, can secure its own interests as well as the interests of regional allies. The rationale behind regional engagement towards China was best described by the Philippines' Undersecretary to Foreign Policy. It's like a stone. A constant pour of water will erode it, however hard the rock is. And indeed, there is increasing evidence that increased Chinese contact with regional institutions, most notably ASEAN, has established peaceful norms as central to Chinese regional policy. In 2002, China signed the Declaration of Conduct in the South China Sea, and in 2003 became the first non-ASEAN state to ratify the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Both of these have non-interference and non-aggression as central tenets. Furthermore, there has been increased evidence that China is sensitive to traditional major power security concerns. Not only do the ASEAN Plus 3 talks occur yearly in conjunction with the ASEAN Plus 1 talks, ASEAN Plus 3 including Japan and South Korea, but in 2005, China revived talks regarding North Korean denuclearization and authored the document that stemmed from these talks. This trend towards multilateralism, coupled with economic integration, including China and ASEAN's trade, which reached $192.5 billion in 2008, and China and Japan's reciprocal and robust trade relations, show that China and East Asia are moving towards a central system that establishes peace and economic cooperation as central to regional stability. Furthermore, even traditionally tense places like Taiwan, which seem to be unable to be resolved multilaterally, have become increasingly open and diplomatic towards China. The 2008 election of Kuomintang candidate Ma Ying-jeou and his subsequent 4-year term eased tensions between the mainland and Taiwan. Indicative of this was the beginning of direct flights between the two areas. His re-election in 2012 shows that Taiwan and China have hopes for a positive and diplomatic solution to their territorial disputes, and that a peaceful resolution can be made in this hot topic of conflict. Using these historical examples, the US should continue to foster institutional development and should also be a part of regional integration in multilateral organizations. The appointment in 2011 of a permanent ambassador to ASEAN, David Carnes, shows a positive step that the US is taking towards not only encouraging multilateralism in the area, but also ensuring that the United States' interests are also served. Using these frameworks and through regional engagement, we can solve tensions in the area that remain unresolved, most notably in the South China Sea. Engagement will lower risks of miscommunication, increase chances of peaceful resolution, and not distance China from a positive system that it itself has embraced. By engaging and not forcing regional actors to ally with the United States or with China in a polarizing balancing system, we can ensure that regional integration will not only have the Chinese and regional actors' security concerns at heart, but also the United States'. Thus, we should continue to foster engagement through institutional development and economic integration in a peaceful manner.
My name is Garrett, and I'm here to talk about the economic relationship between China and the United States. Our position is that a strategy of engagement and interdependence will be the most mutually beneficial for both countries and will mitigate any risks of conflict. So China and the US enjoy a strongly interdependent trade relationship. Total goods and service trade between the US and China was around $540 billion in 2011. We're the largest recipient of Chinese exports. China is the third largest recipient of US exports. So both nations' economies rely on the strength of one another. Foreign direct investment by United States companies in China was also huge. In 2010, it was around $60 billion. So US firms enjoy access to Chinese labor, and China's local economy benefits from that. China is also a developing country, though. There's lots of room for continued growth. Many Chinese people live in conditions of poverty. Hundreds of millions of them do. So as those sectors of China's economy continue to improve, US and Chinese trade relations will only get stronger. So our position is that in addition to taking actions to foster this trade, we should engage China in multilateral free trade agreements in the region to ensure that this relationship stays strong. So a lot of people in the media voice concerns about China's economic rise, and the most common thing that one hears is that their GDP will surpass ours, and it will. China's GDP growth rate right now is around 10%, and the general consensus is that by about 2030, China's GDP will surpass that of the United States. My response to that is, so what? There's more room in the region with a higher GDP for strong trade. Also, per capita GDP in the United States will still be about 3 times as high. So while China will have an overall higher GDP, US citizens will enjoy better living standards, better access to education, etc. There's also limits, as Sam mentioned, to China's growth. Most notably, experts estimate that a result of their one-child policy will be that by 2040, there'll be a 2-to-1 worker-to-retiree ratio in China, which will slow economic growth and cause it to level out as economic growth does in any developing country. Another concern that's common is that China holds a large portion of US debt. I believe the figure is around $1.2 trillion. It's a quarter of foreign-held US debt. But the size of that is more of a burden to China than it is to us. It serves as a limit on Chinese aggression towards the United States. China knows that if, in a hypothetical scenario, war were to break out between the two countries, they might not have access to that money. Finally, people voice concern that China's education system is better at science and engineering than ours. However, the United States is and continues to be a greater source of innovation and research and development in the economic relationship. While Chinese firms are very good at manufacturing, the United States has 15 of the top 20 universities in the world. Our firms create about 90% of China's high-tech exports, and 90% of China's students that come to get PhDs in science and engineering in the United States stay in the United States and work for our companies. So both economies play a vital role. China is a manufacturing one, the United States is an innovative one. Neither can really function well without the other, but we're not concerned about China surpassing the United States in that regard. So in terms of policy recommendations, our position is that the US should avoid any undue signs of aggression toward China and avoid sending bad signals. And we think the most notable example of this is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a currently proposed multilateral free trade agreement in the region. It was originally started by Singapore, Chile, Brunei, and New Zealand. There's numerous other countries currently negotiating membership, including the United States. Japan has voiced an interest. Canada might join negotiations in the future. But notably absent from the negotiation table is China. The United States hasn't explicitly said that China can't join the TPP, although there are environmental and labor condition restrictions in the TPP that would basically block China from joining. So we believe it's vital that the United States work to bring China to the negotiation table on the TPP, let them broker terms that are realistic for them to meet, and avoid sending the signal to Beijing that they're somehow not welcome in this new economic alliance that we're forming with other countries in the region. Finally, we should continue our strong economic relations with other countries, including Japan and South Korea in the region, to ensure that the economic arrangement in East Asia is multilateral and not dominated by anyone. Now I'll turn it over to Sam for concluding remarks.
Okay, I'd like to summarize our presentation by briefly taking you through what each of the members of our group have argued and relating how that supports our main argument that it is best for America to engage China rather than attempt to contain it. Our first point is that a strong China is not inherently aggressive, and to believe that this is so is a flawed application of power transition theory, which really holds no great credibility in the 21st century due to technological innovations and the effects of globalization. Also, we believe it is not in China's interest to pursue an aggressive military agenda. Instead, we should provide increased avenues for military communication and cooperation. We believe that China has shown a willingness to work with regional partners and multilateral institutions. We should foster and encourage that tendency so that all actors in the region can benefit and we can avoid an unnecessary escalation or conflict. We believe that the Chinese and American economies are strongly interdependent and mutually beneficial. This is a relationship that has worked for both nations throughout the past few decades. There's no reason why we shouldn't strengthen that relationship and continue to reap the benefits far into the future. For all of these reasons, we believe it is in the United States' best interest to engage China, not contain it. And I'd like to summarize with a quote from the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton given in her America's Pacific Century address in November of 2011, in which she says, "The fact is that a thriving America is good for China, and a thriving China is good for America. We both have much more to gain from cooperation than from conflict." Thank you very much.
Great presentation. I'll now open it up to floor. Like to get us started? Jeff?
Thanks for the thoughtful presentation. I just wonder how you deal with kind of recent history where there seems to be evidence that the U.S. has in fact adopted your strategy and that strategy failed. Okay, so when Obama came in, there was a big outreach to China. You know, G2, let's make friends, let's get along, we'll bring you in. And China was like, they're losers. These guys are losers, right? And they're not players anymore. And they became very assertive around Asia and did a lot of things that we really didn't like. And the Obama administration said, hey, this isn't working. We need to do something different. So they introduced the pivot, right? And the pivot is we are going to be here, we are going to be a part of things, and we're going to keep a continued military presence, which you guys don't like, right? So I'm wondering why, and you know what? China has become much more cooperative since that happened. So does that not go against the case you're making?
I actually don't think it does go against the case that we're making, and perhaps we should have been more clear. We do not think that the U.S. should pull back from the region. We think that America's attention towards the region is extremely important, that it is a vital U.S. interest, East Asia. We do not think that military presence should disappear from the region. I think perhaps we should have been more clear about that. All we're saying is we shouldn't promote an influx of troops because we think that could be alarmist. Instead, we should be clear to the Chinese that we're going to be involved in the region, that we're here to stay, but also that we would much rather pursue the opposite of that. We would much rather pursue economic and diplomatic measures rather than attempt to bully the Chinese into doing what we want. We think that is simply a major setback in goals that both nations would like to achieve.
So I'm just to press you on this. So you started off saying the deployment of troops to Australia was bad, but what if that is the part that actually got the Chinese attention? Well, these guys are serious, right? And is it necessarily incompatible to strengthen the military and engage China, which is what the presentation started off saying it wasn't possible? You may be limited to that in your debating terms. So.
Well, we should have said that we do not believe that there should not be a military presence in China. Really, what we were focusing on was communication between the two militaries. So if the U.S. wants to engage further militarily in China, we need to make sure that there are enough avenues of communication and there's enough clarity there that China can see that we are protecting U.S. interests in the region, but this is not meant to be a threatening, domineering strategy meant to block China from also benefiting from trade in the South China Sea or what have you.
I'd also like to answer this in that you point to kind of recent history as indicative of maybe a harder line Chinese approach towards its own backyard, and that only a hard line United States response can kind of force it to back down. However, there was a decade of peace in the South China Sea relatively, and only recently did the kind of tensions flare up when in 2011 Vietnam kind of conducted live fire drills. So whether or not kind of China's recent flexing in the South China Sea is indicative of a change in Chinese policy is unclear. This could perhaps just be due to the fact that there might be a regime change coming up and a power transition, not quite in the same way that Ref was talking about, but that Chinese policymakers kind of are shoring up some of their political concerns to ensure internal stability, and that it does not represent a long-term threat to United States security in the area.
Michael?
My question is sort of related to Professor LeGros. I mean, first of all, you guys did an excellent job, and I think in particular, because this is such a broad topic, it's not like the Iran issue where it's sort of one specific issue. This is like covers hundreds of policies. You guys really covered a lot of ground, and that was really impressive. The question I still have, though, is I felt like you guys sort of focused on the low-hanging fruit, sort of the areas where the U.S. and China, both sides pretty much want to cooperate. It's pretty easy to get along. I think we can all agree we want trade and economic growth and military-to-military contacts. That's all well and good, but what do you guys think we should do about U.S. alliances in the region, and in particular with Japan and the sort of implicit security guarantee that we have vis-a-vis Taiwan? Because obviously from China's perspective, with the Taiwan issue, they see that as a renegade province that we've sort of extended some protection towards. And with Japan, that's, Chinese textbooks to this day still really emphasize how this country, really oppressed them in a very brutal way. So will you pull back from those assurances that the United States has given, or will you maintain them and just hope that being nice to China on these other issues will sort of overcome conflict that would come from those alliances?
I think I want to begin by addressing the Taiwan issue. So one thing that you're absolutely correct that China considers Taiwan to be still its territory, and Taiwan is sort of considers itself to be have a different identity than the PRC. But in recent years, we've read articles and come across data that indicates that it's more of there's a generational split between the younger Taiwanese and the older Taiwanese, and as Will was talking about with the current political party in power in Taiwan, it seems as though the Taiwanese are not about to make a big push for independence or do anything extremely radical that would force China to, in turn, also react radically. So we believe that in Taiwan and in the South China Sea, China should be content to sort of let the status quo lie, because they are claiming that they own the islands, and while other countries disagree with that, they are able to reap the economic benefits without really pushing the sovereignty issue to any extremes. And we don't really see any reason why they should force that issue if they're already getting positive benefits out of it, and if they can say to themselves that they have control in the region. As for the Japan issue, we've seen some evidence recently. There were talks between South Korea and Japan that didn't eventually go through, but are indications of some soft power balancing in the region. So we think that the U.S. should definitely still support its allies in the region, but we also think it won't be an undue, like a huge burden on the U.S. because if Japan and South Korea continue to see China as sort of a threat, they can sort of balance out within the region. And the more that we push multilateralism and cooperation, the more that those tensions should die down, and our allies can be convinced that China is not a threat to their interests.
I think, sorry, just one more comment. It's also significant, like Okinawa, the base in Okinawa, and in South Korea as well. There's also demands from the people in their own nations on what to do with the U.S. military. So that's a whole other factor to include, whether or not Japan wants U.S. presence in the region, or South Korea as well. If we're going to see distancing or not, that's another factor.
And I think that the other thing is that you brought up nationalism as part of the argument, and I think that it is important to notice that I think Chinese nationalism today is much more subdued than it was in the past. And I think it is also important to notice that I don't think nationalism plays that big of a deal in foreign policy decisions, and it shouldn't be channeled more into revisionist tendencies, but rather I think nationalism would have more relevant application in the Taiwan issue, because China would still want to gain tendencies. But we shouldn't just assume that, well, because of this nationalist tendencies in China, we should be ramping up security or military bases in Asia. I think that'll be a volatile response.
John?
Okay, yeah, very good, guys. So I guess my question, it's not really about power transition theory directly, but I'm wondering why China, as it rises, is going to accept such a diminished status relative to what we demand, right? I mean, why are they not going to want their own Monroe Doctrine? We would never put up with the things that you're about to ask of them. You know, basically rely on us to protect their sea lanes. Look, peaceful rise is excellent from our perspective. From theirs, it means utter dependence on other great powers for their immediate security. I cannot envision a great power worth the name accepting that role indefinitely. So I want to know, beyond just saying the theory is dead, why, if you're a Chinese decision, why would you ever put up with this?
So I see China B is nodding behind you, and I think you're going to really enjoy their argument. But
Sam.
Not necessarily.
Sam. No.
Well, I'll begin, and then I think we'll also like to talk about this issue a little bit. As you brought up the Monroe Doctrine that the U.S. has sort of in the Western Hemisphere, and I think you're questioning why China wouldn't want something similar for themselves in the Eastern Hemisphere. I think my main critique of that would be the South China Sea is not the Caribbean. The trade lanes that are present there are much more important to regional actors, and it makes sense that multiple countries that have an interest in that region should be able to protect those interests there. And I think that there's no reason to believe that China should be relying on the U.S. to protect its interests. It's obviously still building up its military and defensive capabilities. It still has to worry about its land borders. Really, if both sides are bent on cooperation, there's no reason why China should see the U.S. as, or China should feel beholden to the U.S. in any way, unless it decides to be very revisionist and radical, in which case any state would face repercussions, the repercussions of those actions.
I was just going to bring up that we sort of believe that China really lacks the power projection necessary to kind of make a Monroe Doctrine of its own backyard, and that China still has to choose between naval investment and land security and securing its own borders. And furthermore, while we can assume that linear GDP growth will allow them to invest more in the military as their economy grows, it's an awfully big assumption to make, and there are, as Garrett said, a lot of other things domestically that China has to deal with before it can invest in a military that nearly, can even be mentioned in the same sentence as the United States without kind of a disclaimer.
And the other part of it is that China, I think, has to recognize that they need the United States in a cooperative relationship in order for them to continue growing or reaping some sort of economic growth, which has happened to them. And I think, yes, maybe when they do reach that great power status, which they wouldn't want to see it into a skewed relationship with the U.S. I think that the backflip of that is that they stand more to lose if they don't see it into a cooperative relationship with the USA. And I think that alone will sort of rein them in and sort of allow them to sort of maybe push for more autonomy, but still in a relationship that is still cooperative with the relationship.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. Paul?
Yes, so in your presentation you appeal a lot to the pocketbook, which I always think is a good place to appeal. And I look forward under your policies to trips to Walmart where I can buy my daughter cheap and dangerous Chinese toys. My question has to do more with the sort of ideological component of your policy. Essentially, it strikes me that to make your policy work, the U.S. would essentially have to give up its commitment to things like human rights, democracy, some of the core principles that the U.S. has tried to promote internationally since its founding. To get the benefits of this engagement with China, we'd have to stop talking about Tibet, stop talking about the suppression of political freedoms and religious dissidents inside of China. Are you comfortable with that, abandoning that fundamental core U.S. commitment so that we can enjoy cheap Chinese products in Walmart? Is that a trade-off that the U.S. should be willing to make between its principles and its pocketbook?
I think that the U.S. has already shown that it has a willingness to abandon its own ideals when it comes to strategic partners that we deem to be of utmost importance. And furthermore, it is our belief that the more China is engaged in a system that the United States can manipulate and can advance its own ideals within, that China will realize the benefits of integrating itself into the system and will relax its restrictions on some things, including the Tibet issue, as well as political distance within its own country.
Yes, and if we want to have influence in China, if we want to potentially change things like human rights conditions or labor conditions further down the line, I think we believe that the smartest way to go about that is by strengthening our relationship with China now, so that however many years in the future, as the relationship gets stronger, that's when we can start pressuring them to change some of their policies that we don't agree with. And that will be when they would be in a position where they would be more responsive to international pressures on those sorts of issues.
Okay, last question. Before we go to the last question, just want to thank Professor Sam Crane in the back for all the wonderful help he's given us. Brendan, final question?
The heart of your case is basically that there are no rational incentives for aggression here on either side. But basically the problem with international politics is the great powers are crazy. There's very rarely any rational incentives for aggression, and with great power come greatly interesting hobbies. And that's why power transition theory has basically been right throughout most of history. You know, we had like this giant scramble for Africa in the 19th century, which was a place that was more or less intrinsically worthless, and yet the great powers ended up in these giant fights over it, right? You know, right now, you know, Professor Crane introduced me to this great slogan the other day, "No blood for mackerel," right? Which is essentially the stakes in the South China Sea, and yet we still have these powers fighting and coming, and with all this sort of natural clash that just power brings you into, you want to leave me in the hands of tucking shops? And we're going to have like some more high-level meetings, maybe, and maybe we'll get Clyde out there to like open the ceremonies or something. What is this really a policy that makes any sense, just given the past history of how great powers behave, rational or not?
So I would have a question first for like what your alternative would be. Would it just be
prepare for the inevitable clash, right? Get ready to protect American interests.
Well, fortunately for modern policymakers, the scramble for Africa is almost incredibly irrelevant to how we view Chinese relations today. There are a number of factors that Ref brought up, including nuclear deterrence, including globalization, not simply trade, which people could point to, you know, the fact that trade before World War I was astoundingly high, but globalization where actual firms from individual nations are putting factories in other nations and increasing economic interdependence, not simply through trade, and that there are these factors that make the global community much more sensitive to kind of its own little hobbies, as you put it, in Africa, or little excursions where they shouldn't, where really they're amping up tensions. And I think that we can see that most great powers today, or major powers, let's say, realize that the stakes of kind of escalation are no longer what they used to be, and that they can't afford to kind of engage in these.
And I think the heart of what we said is that we shouldn't be allowing the specter of the 19th and 20th century to haunt the 21st century. We should be willing to like counter and seek the tragedies of past power transitions into a way that will be much more cooperative and fruitful for both nations going forward. And I think that if we are to bring South China Sea into it, the problem with it is that I don't think China could ever potentially lay it does lay a maximalist claim on the South China Sea, but it can never reach a point to which it can enforce that or implement that sort of like maximalist claim to it.
And this is probably my fault for sprinting through the military thing because for reasons, but we're still spending over $900 billion on our military, and it's not like we're advocating retraction from the area or anything like that. It's not like U.S. security.
So we will fight for the South China Sea Island? Is that the policy?
No, that's not the policy. But what would...
Would
there will not be a fight for the South
people
China
in the
Sea
regions
Islands.
just...
That will no military.
Okay, guys, we actually have to bring this to an end, and I thank you so much for coming.